Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of the Cosmic Wizard Show. And I'm here with Michael Hartigan again from One Sky Astrology. And we are almost, but not quite, finished our series on unusual oppositions. And the usual suspects as well, but we both practice constellational astrology, which means we use the actual sizes and shapes of the constellations. And so it ends up that there's some unusual oppositions that aren't normally talked about. So that's what we're doing in this series. Hi, Michael.
Hey Ria, thanks for having me on. Thanks for being a cosmic wizard, and hi everybody. Nice to connect with you all.
Thank you as always for chatting with me today. So we're in Sagittarius season, and so we're going to be chatting Sag and its oppositions. We've got some kind of weird ones and one that neither of us have ever really considered before. But before we get to that, we're going to talk about the classic pairing, which is Gemini and Sagittarius. I was having some fun
Right.
thoughts about today. What are your off the top of your head thoughts on this one, Michael?
Off the cuff. Wow. Sag and Gemini. Sag and Gemini, we've talked about some interesting and some unique axis. I remember when we were talking about Pisces, Virgo, we mentioned some of the unique qualities and likewise, all the axes have their own sort of personalities. Just coming from looking at Scorpio, Fucus, and Taurus, and how those were like very opposite in many ways. Like we have stability and then destabilization, establishment and then disestablishment, basically. But Sag and Gemini have, I think, a lot in common. I think they actually share maybe more than any other of the oppositions that I can think of. So they also, like Pisces and Virgo, make a pretty clear right brain, left brain split, where you have that Gemini. In fact, I've seen it said that one of the things that Gemini, or rather its ruler, Mercury, when you have Mercury retrograde, that one of the things that means is that actually Jupiter comes to the fore and right brain thinking becomes more dominant in Mercury retrograde people, that
Oh,
left brain
interesting.
correlate with Gemini
Yeah.
takes a backseat, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Interesting for sure.
yeah, and then at the same time, I think just right off the cuff, just to start, I think that Sag and Gemini are both really, they're a little bit hard to understand. They're often, I think, glossed, and I hear them kind of left at the gloss level a lot. And maybe I'm being
Oh,
critical or
okay.
picky, but I think there's a lot more there than I usually hear mentioned in the run of the mill, sort of like this is Gemini and this is Sag, kind of textbook stuff. So hopefully we can find some room for some of these more interesting aspects of Sag and Gemini that may be appropriate to talking about it as an
Yeah.
axis.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I like Sag and Gemini as an axis. It interests me a lot. It's one that's really like alive in my own chart.
Hmm.
And one thing that I was thinking of this morning as I was getting ready for our call is that I feel like it's kind of like I feel like some of like the ADD sort of stuff is very alive in it. Like I
Very.
personally, like if I don't have that like genuine curiosity factor, which I find is very much like a big Gemini theme,
Yeah.
and it doesn't feel like legitimately true to me, which is more on the Sagittarius side. I
Right.
just like I have to force myself to do it. It doesn't flow, right? Whereas if those two sort of facets are a lot more alive, then I can be like really excited and involved in things.
That's interesting. That's
Mhm.
interesting. Um, I
And my random
have
thought.
very little going on in that axis in
Mm.
my own chart.
Oh, okay.
I I have, I practice in reading charts. I see Sag and Gemini like have their effect, and I think it's very interesting. But like you were saying earlier, that some of these off the cuff alignments
Mhm.
are kind of new to us and hadn't really considered that. Sag and Gemini were one of the last things. This is kind of one of the last relationships, axial relationships that I really learned about because
Oh, okay.
um and it's interesting because it's important to me. You have like philosophical truth and all this,
Mhm.
like the ocean of information, and then like being Gemini, the information correlate with Gemini, and then out of that you have the search for meaning.
Mhm.
Sag, truth, what is
Okay.
actually, and other things that are really important to me, like you have natural law in Sag. It's so important. It's where in the sky, just how things are really shows up.
Mhm.
And that's a way that is totally different, isn't it, to Gemini? Because Gemini is more about labeling and organizing, but Sag is,
One thing that I feel like is quite lost in Gemini is that that is something that I feel like they do share actually
hmm,
is just that like one is so much bigger picture, that one being
hmm,
Sag for our watchers, of course, and one is so like small and focused. But I feel like it's very experiential, in both is the like desire to figure things out, and
yeah, yeah,
I feel like in Gemini, like especially coming from Taurus, which is very much like, which is, I think, in its own sort of situation, it's just like a lot more self-contained,
it
whereas
is, it
in
is, yeah,
Gemini,
yeah,
it's like,
and
oh,
in an
now I want
inner, yeah,
to, yeah, exactly.
yeah,
And then in Gemini, that focus is sort of turned outwards.
hmm,
And we're like,
hmm,
okay, I want to experience life and figure things out by having that experience with others, or
right, right, right,
through like seeing myself in other, whether that's like an actual other person
right.
or different ideas.
It's true. It's true. That's really brilliant. That's a great way to start looking at Gemini. And I agree with all that. There's a curiosity and a drive to there's something in Gemini that matches this, expansive quality of Sagittarius. It always wants to
Mhm.
grow and become more and more. And
Yeah.
Gemini too, through curiosity,
Mhm.
always wants to increase its understanding and its body of knowledge. You
Yeah.
holding a thought? Are you
It
holding a thought?
is like through the progression that happens, it is still like compared to Sag, it is a little like self-centered, just because like that's the process we've just been through. But
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's still the idea of like, okay, now I want to expand, now I want to learn more. And it's like a lot more smaller focused just because
Mm, yeah, yeah.
like the process of life is a little bit smaller at that point than after we go through like the whole process of, you know, merging with others and learning more about being part of a society and all that sort of stuff.
Right, right, right. The
Right.
relationship. I think you're pointing to something that's important here. And I would say it as the way I would say it is that Gemini is like, okay, so to build on what you were just going over, in Taurus, we're always going to be relating to ourselves. It's
Mhm.
very inward, our value system, our whole inner experience really is, especially if we look at Aries as the kind of like starting point of a
Mhm.
cycle of individuation, then Taurus is really the first time we take a look inward or
Mhm.
in the whole developmental process. And out of that, out of like the nebulousness of the inner world and the need to kind of like communicate our inner experience, I think we
Mhm.
develop systems, semantic and logical systems of labeling and categorizing and classifying things that allow us to make use of our world and to share. And this
Mhm.
is one of those really hard to kind of grasp things about Gemini, but Gemini is what allows us to connect inner experience to each other's inner experience and share it.
Yeah, for sure.
So it is developmental in that it's like that Aries, Taurus, Gemini. It's like very primal, very, very just like it's almost like it's like rough. And then through the processes that lead to Sagittarius up to and including like, let's say, Libra and seventh house processes of connecting, definitely in important ways with other people, and then eighth house processes of like really coming face to face with things that could either terrify or transform or somehow like mutate you. And then out of the sort of destabilization of all that, we get the ninth house, which is, yeah, it's polished. It's more complex, and it's got a polish to it that I think Gemini doesn't have. And I'm not going to try and correlate that with like qualities of Sag or Gemini. I'm just going to leave it very basic, that I think of Sag as like where Gemini's going,
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, cool. I'm glad that came across.
Yeah. And it has that Gemini, that is, has that correlation with siblings, right? And even like the sort of iconography of the twin. And so it's that sort of experience, that like first peer experience, a little bit.
First fear experience.
No, like peer experience.
Peer. Thank you.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's sort of like that first real like step out and wanting to relate to something.
Right.
And I think about the twin, and I think a lot of what
All right.
ta-da.
Technical difficulties.
I think about the twins, and I feel like, and I've mentioned this a little bit already, but it is that like that first step that sort of does complete in Sag of like, like I can learn more about myself through connecting with other people, and then that sort of
That's it.
expands way out in
It's like
Sag.
the other side of the looking glass, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which has its limitations a little bit, but it's a very important kind of first step. And I do find
It is, yeah.
with like people, I have a lot of Geminis in my life, actually. Like my grandma, my mom, my husband, tons of them. Like,
all right.
I do think that there is like, I feel like Geminis get like labeled sort of like naturally as things that are actually like more Taurus, like people sort of like label them as like their own islands and stuff like that. And like, and they get the stereotype of being like flighty, which isn't particularly
Two-faced. That's the classic, isn't it?
That is
That
the
the
classic.
Gemini is
Yeah.
two-faced. I find it at times it can be true of anyone. I find that almost overly reductionist, like, oh, there's the twins, there's going to be two sides of this thing. Yeah, sometimes, but go ahead, Rio, go ahead. It is truly a cliche that people are flighty, or even going back to the first thing you said, which was like ADHD. It's all there. It is. There's a very scattered, little bit superficial compared to Sag energy. That's just like, oh, what's going on? Yeah,
it is definitely a little bit superficial. And at the same time, I feel like, at least of like all the Geminis that I know in my life, and maybe this too is because like, if a person has a lot of Gemini, they probably have a decent amount of Cancer too, just with the way that Mercury and Venus are linked to the sun and so on. But I do find that there is actually like a deep caring for the people that they have in their life. And like not necessarily too much of a capacity always to like vulnerably connect, if that makes sense. And
do you find that people, instead of, and I don't I don't. So I guess before I ask that question that I was just about to formulate, do you mean connect with themselves or connect with other people like you,
I think
for
a bit
example?
of I think a bit of both,
A bit of both.
right?
Do you think in Gemini the tendency might be to intellectualize rather than actually experiencing when it comes to feelings? Or okay, yeah,
Yeah,
I
for sure.
found that too. I found that too, and I think it fits the cookbook understanding of Gemini. Yeah, it's not so much that it's a rationalization, and it goes along with that ability to rationalize
But it,
positions. Yeah, yeah, no, you
like,
say.
in my personal experience anyways, I find that they like do tend to actually be like extremely loyal. They
Hmm.
just like aren't necessarily like like I don't know. They aren't necessarily like that good at like coming out and like saying the thing,
Mm,
right? And
mm.
like
I think I
maybe
know what you
it's
mean.
like but like they'll always still be there, which I find in the
Mm.
mythology of Gemini too, right? Like the twins
Oh,
of
yeah,
Gemini, like one of
they
them
are.
died and
Yeah,
the other one begged Zeus to like take him so that his brother wouldn't die.
right,
There's
right.
I think there's more going on than people give it credit for.
Yeah,
But
I think so too. I think it gets short. What's the expression? Short
range?
shrifted, short change, just superficial. And I don't think it's necessarily superficial as much as Sagittarius, which it gets compared to, is
Mm,
so deep by its very nature, with the
yeah,
quest for meaning and the quest for truth.
yeah.
Um,
And because there is that like drive for like learning and experiential, just like figuring things out.
hmm.
And like they do definitely have a capacity to see many different sides of things, right?
They do. That's it. That's it. I
Right.
love
Which
I
I think
love
is a
that
gift, but
because Sag, when we talk about Sag and we talk about like all these buzzwords that it's very famous for, like it represents natural law and it's correlate with truth. All these ideas are really important, but um, the dark side of that in Sag is that we see like totally convinced examples of people who want to then convert others. You see inside, you see missionaries, you see
the zealot,
proselytization, you see
yeah,
conversion, you see people who know it alls who
there,
are zealous.
yeah,
And that's
for
where Sag really needs that Gemini curiosity to remember that there are probably as many ways of looking at
sure.
any issue as there are people in existence. So that's infinite,
Yeah,
right off. So that's where Gemini gets a little, I think, ADHD without Sag, is it gets
mm,
so unhinged in the world of
yeah,
ideas that it needs to anchor.
yeah, for
Which
sure.
this then again is like why all the oppositions, why we're talking about them in terms of oppositions, because they complete each other and need each other.
Mhm.
Just kind of touch on that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's definitely the spot where like it's easy to get lost in the mind and like brain candy and like always
Yes.
feeding more and more and
Rabbit
more.
holes. It's the axis of rabbit holes.
Yes, for sure.
So-
Yeah. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, that definitely is like sort of the dark side of Sag is the I'm right
Mhm.
and this is the only truth.
Yeah. Games with truth are this axis is like information and truth.
Hmm.
Because I think the dark side of Gemini is like it can take that trickster archetype and go too far with it. It can get
Yeah, that's
into
true.
like, everything is just information. Oh, it's just what we call it. Oh, I can lie so easily and
Yeah,
there's no
yeah.
real, it doesn't mean anything. And it's not really a complete idea. The way our words affect people does mean something, and truth
Hmm.
is real, which is what Sag is all about.
Hmm. Yeah, very
I
much.
I think if there was one word for Sag, it would be truth, and just how things really are. Like before we put any labels on them, or before we put language on it, or call a
Mhm.
tree a tree. because a tree is a Gemini thing. Like I say tree, and you know what I mean. It's a thing, and we stop there because it's like tree. But Sag is like, well, wait a minute, hold on. That's a point on a map. It's a node in a semantic framework. But
Mhm.
when we put the semantic framework aside an experience, right, back to the difference between experience and rationalization or academic kind of approach to things. When we
Mhm.
experience the tree, it's infinite unto itself. There's a world
Mhm.
there. You could get lost gazing at a 1 inch by 1 inch piece of bark and with the life forms and what's going on, and it wouldn't take long to just blow your mind. And that's sort of, as I feel, as a Sag Gemini axis too. That kind of like,
Mhm.
it's what drives the curiosity. We'll discover novelties, right? We'll
Mhm.
have our mind expanded,
Yeah.
Sag, right? We'll have our mind blown, like if we're kind of engaging in the whole thing.
For sure. Yeah. Worth mentioning probably is it's kind of like the student teacher axis.
Very nice. Yeah, it sure is. Sure is. Sag being correlated with teachers and
Mhm.
gurus and stuff, and Gemini being appropriately correlate with that kind of young learner vibe, the
Mhm.
curious one, the one who wants to receive the truth.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. Um, and
yeah.
one thing we haven't talked about at all is Sag's association with the quality of expansion that
Mhm.
starts to take its form in everyday life as long journeys or pilgrimages,
Yeah.
travelers, immigrants, vagrants, homeless. Um, so Sag is ruling wealth and so much increase, but it also rules the kind of homelessness that's like more itinerant, just the wandering.
Mm.
So there can be and I think of that archetype of the alchemist, like Paulo Coelho's alchemist, the
Mhm.
wanderer who goes to discover the inner treasure. It's
Yeah.
like such a Jupiterian, Sagittarian,
Yeah, for sure.
like a trope or something. Yeah.
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 Yeah. And to the the expansion of if Gemini is sort of where we're like meeting our first people that kind of expand our mind, like
Mm,
Sag is a lot more of like what happens when you go and experience an entirely different culture and like
mm.
have your mind blown of like, oh, hey, like our way of doing things is like in no way the only way.
Right,
There is that
right.
like certain level of education quote that can only be experienced by like seeing how other people live completely differently.
Well said. Well said. Yeah. Yeah. That's my favorite thing about traveling is seeing how other people get on and organize themselves into society. And it's just
Mm.
you realize when you've only lived, it's like there's a parable about this, about the frog and the well. When you've only lived in a well, you think that that's the world, but in this parable, the frog in the well met another frog, and that frog was from like the ocean. I know there's no frogs in the ocean, but this is, stay with me. The frog in the ocean was like, oh yeah, you got to get out of this well and check it out. It's big. It's there's water, there's light, air, this is a massive world. And the frog in the well is like, I know, look, water, air, light, like I'm solid. And the guy's like, no, you can't understand. And in a way, Sag is always kind of pulling us out of the known.
Hmm.
And in another way, and it's not black and white, but in another way, Gemini is always going to be known in the sense that it's where we agree. It's built on those frameworks that we
Hmm.
like. If I call it a tree and that doesn't mean anything to you, there's no usefulness in the
Hmm.
word, right? Where you and I could speak totally different languages and have no linguistic basis for connecting, but if we were alone in a field and all there was a tree, you and I could have an experience of the tree and
Hmm.
actually maybe out of that without words. Who knows what might be communicated intuitively or instinctively.
Mhm.
That's Sagittarius territory. So we
Yeah.
start to see how they're really totally different, and how they're quite similar, and how they really complement each other,
Mhm.
how they work together as an axis.
One thing that got me thinking on the sort of like travel thread and like journeying to different cultures and stuff like that is like we have, not only do you tend to have your mind totally expanded by like the differences, but also by like going through these different kind of experiences, that's where you find like, okay, what's true? Like, what's the same no matter what makes
Right.
us
Right.
human,
I
and
love that litmus. I love that. Yeah.
that's sort
What
of like
works all the time?
truth,
Yeah.
of like,
Right.
oh, how are we similar, like,
Yeah.
are we dancing? Are we
Yeah.
making music? Are we like loving our families,
Yeah. Yeah. And the cliche is that you find, and I think it's a good cliche. The cliche is that you find that when you do sit down with other people face to face, you find that everyone has so much more in common than we
Mhm,
have.
for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. That's almost feels like a Sag Gemini axis kind of idea,
Mhm.
like encompassed in that axis. But I really couldn't elucidate how or put my finger on that, so I'll just leave that
I feel like in
leave that there.
Gemini, it's kind of like the brain candy of like when we want to like discuss with people and like kind of like debate
Mm,
for fun,
mhm.
and then in
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Sag, it's more like wanting to find those similarities and those truths that we can come
yeah.
on a little bit.
And there's an irony there too that I think is worth pointing out, because like you were saying, in Gemini we're we're in Gemini, actually very much what we're doing through seeking and learning and understanding is we're stabilizing our world inwardly, but we're expanding it through connecting with others linguistically, through learning and encompassing the world mentally. We're starting to kind of like build a map,
Mhm.
and a lot of it through language. And Gemini is very social. It brings people together. And the irony that I want to point out is that even though that matures and develops in Sagittarius, one of the qualities of Sagittarius that I find just a little bit undermentioned,
Mhm.
generally speaking, is alienation.
Mhm.
Alienation, because the truth seeker, the Sagittarian truth seeker who's actually concerned with how things really are beyond language. The society, the mainstream, the status quo is not and has never been into that. So
Mhm.
Sagittarius and the interest in truth is always going to be relating to the sort of next sign, Capricorn,
Mhm.
and how far do we want to go into what's true, because we're risking saying that a tree isn't a tree and the whole thing is nonsense. We made the whole thing up, and that then it crumbles. That's
Feels
very dangerous, actually.
This feels kind of alive with like Pluto exiting Sagittarius right now. Like I
Right,
feel like
right,
the world in general has kind of like been in this zone for a while.
right. That's an interesting observation. Yeah, 2006, 2007, Pluto's been in Sag, and that's, yeah. I mean, I think we've seen just more profound alienation.
You know, a tree is still a
Yeah.
tree, but what's a woman? What's a man?
Mm,
We've we've definitely started to like tackle some of like the bedrock of things that were
right.
understood as a thing, but is it
And
actually?
looking at assumptions,
Yeah.
looking at rethinking the map, the very
Mm-hmm.
basis. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there are good things and difficult things that come out of it. I think the alienation is more on a personal level, that once you get yourself in a Sag process and commit to any degree to truth, you've snubbed the mainstream. You've snubbed the conformists, right? And it happens without even like an overt snub. There's no one actually like kicks dirt on you, but it just happens by degrees. And then one day you find yourself, you're just not able to relate to people.
Mm-hmm.
because you're relating to truth, and most people actually aren't. At
Mhm,
least at this day and age, like at this time in history,
mhm,
in this culture, modern Western culture, to speak very broadly. I think that's one of the great things, one of the great tasks that's set to people who are alive today is to reevaluate. The thinking that got us here is not going to get us out of here.
mm.
Need new thinking.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because and speaks, I think, to the Gemini axis too, because like you can think your way into anything. You can come up with all kinds of stories to justify all kinds of anything.
Mm-hmm.
It happens
Yep.
all the
Yep. Yep.
time.
And stories behind the stories, and stories about the stories, and it's all a house of cards. It's all just words, and we can lead people to start. We can deceive people with words, and then they'll set out with and miss a misformed intention to do a certain action, and then we can feel like, oh, this is really
And we can very
working
easily
great for
mislead
us.
ourselves.
Yeah. But it never works that great, for people long term
Mhm,
to be just playing with words, as if the other side of it, the truth and the meaning and the actual reality of reality,
mhm,
we have to take that into account. And that's another big lesson of the axis, is like there is a reality.
mhm.
There is a truth. Even if this is a simulation, even, I mean, go crazy, even if you're dreaming right now, like there's
Yeah.
something. There's something.
Yeah.
We can't just throw it out and say, could be anything. Who knows? I don't know. I'm gonna, stop there. We can't stop there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do think that there is a little bit of a and this can get like interesting when we want to like play with like what if, because I think anyone who has like dipped their toe in like the true sidereal sort of constellational waters has at least thought the thought, what if Sagittarius is first? You know? Like
And so relative to and I'm just going to sort of say this for the people, but relative to the galactic center, that is a sort of death point, initiates a rebirth, correlate with the entry into Sag.
mhm,
So the way we talk about the psychological process, starting with Aries and ending with Pisces, you're talking about another cycle that would begin with Sag in the passage
mhm.
past the galactic center. Yeah.
And I think that on like some level, there is a bit more of a like primal vibe to Sag than it gets a lot of credit for. And it
Mm.
makes me think of there's something I saw once about, and I'm gonna like sort of butcher this because I don't remember the details, but as an idea, it was how like a particular tribe had the and like I think that this is like something that's actually like alive in more than one culture, but this idea that like babies and old people they like get along on a certain level because they're both like closer to source.
Mhm.
One just came from it, one's about to go back to it. It's sort of like the middle space is where we like fall into the trickery and the semantics and the ideas and all of this. And it's sort of like at those points, pre and post um, conditioning, that we can see things a little more clearly.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, yeah, I love
And
that.
then
Reminds
um,
me of Ponyo, the old
Anya,
people's home. Yeah, Ponyo, the Hayao Miyazaki movie about
okay,
the boy who finds the magic fish. If you've never seen
I've
it,
never
it's
seen
it's
it.
it's priceless. Miyazaki is one of the great storytellers of our time, and it's a beautiful movie. Ponyo is yeah, it's indicative of that. But if you've never seen it, I don't think it's,
All right, well, I'll check it out.
yeah. I'm not gonna get it.
Um, yeah, or even like like babies know what's up before they
Yeah,
know
yeah,
anything, before they know how to like walk or talk or I don't know, it's just that sort of spark. And I feel like there is that and this is something that sort of can be seen as a thread through the fire signs, I think, that there's just like a little bit of like freedom there to see things differently. Um, I don't think
yeah.
I'm gonna articulate this
I
particularly
think I
well.
know. I think I know a little bit of what you're trying to point to. It's almost like for me, what I get where I go is that words are sort of limiting.
Mhm,
They always close in and cut off other options. And the thing about, and there's a natural square between Gemini and Pisces, where the Pisces is like the wholeness of everything, and everything being in everything, and everything being interconnected,
mhm.
and really at a level just one. And then Gemini, when we start to use language and make lists and categorize and get into all this specificity, we really delimit the world, and we kind of reduce the magic of it, the magic of the world,
Yeah. Yeah, it's that sort of like a little bit of like scientist vibe of like we want to figure it out so bad. Uh,
That's it. And I think because Sag makes a natural square to Pisces too. So there's a sort of little bit of disharmony between Sag's philosophical, religious approach
mhm,
and the actual truth, the Piscean truth that these religions like contain, like what's in the box, the flame in the box.
mhm,
And yeah, it's interesting because you said it's conditioning, and there's like Gemini almost represents like pre or before. Actually, Aries represents the mind before conditioning.
mhm.
Aries just represents the pure. But through Gemini's like development of linguistic kind of layers of enamel, like linguistic enamel that harden,
Yeah.
we
I
do
feel
get into we do get into just conditioning that we don't often get a chance to look back on until it's
mhm.
already run its course, right?
So I feel
And
like
I
that's very much in the category of like the conditioning that we build for ourselves. Like we're at the heart of it, we're just sort of trying to like figure things out and like learn things and understand how things work. But in doing that, we build these stories that
right,
turn
right,
into like facts in our mind.
right, right, right.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's the dangerous thing about discovering something and figuring something out, is then, when it seems right, you get convinced, and
Mhm.
that's just one of the artifacts of this axis. You get convinced that your
Yeah.
way is the way. And one of the sad things is it sort of forgets that its way isn't the it sort of forgets that its way isn't the only way. It starts
Mhm.
to think that it is, and that other people should adopt its truth, because it's just
Yeah.
one of Sag's
Certainly
blind
can.
spots.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely used to be like that when I was younger. I got
Yeah,
a
I
little
think I think it's a
mature.
cultural artifact too. I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of Sag in like Abrahamic religious influenced cultures, which that's a lot of cultures today. There's just a sort of like need to be right, a sort of like almost anxiety, like a prior anxiety that um we're that if we go out and sort of like guess or speculate, do Gemini stuff, get curious, maybe try on different things for size, that will be wrong. We might say the wrong thing or have a wrong idea.
Yeah.
And here's an interesting model. We could try this on for size, and this will help us understand Gemini and Sag. Gemini is correlate with inductive reasoning, inductive logic, which is to say that like um there can be in an inductive logic any number of answers that satisfy even looking
What
at
exactly do you mean by inductive logic? Like,
well, like deductive logic is what we use in this culture. In deductive logic, we eliminate choices that seem wrong until we arrive at what the one right choice, and that's brutal, right? Because
yeah,
then we get into arguments. Well, I arrived at this, I arrived at that, and we figure out who's right, but there's only one right.
yeah,
But in an inductive, like in a culture, you see this in indigenous and aboriginal. You see it in you don't see it much in modern Western culture because the colonizers were totally deductive. But in an inductive system, let's say we just have a question, 4 times 2
mhm,
equals. Okay, this we know this, right? No, we don't. That's deductive. We think it's 8, but 4 times 2 could equal 4 plus 4. 4 times 2 could equal 12 minus 4. There's so many ways that you could
yeah,
solve that
okay,
equation correctly.
yeah,
And that's an example of inductive. So Gemini is always inductive, always trying new things, putting this puzzle piece. It's like even if it gets it right, it'll still take it apart, try and build it differently, see if it can get it right a different way. Like just endlessly Gemini. And the deductive, the one true truth, right? That Sag is like actually like, for better or worse, established with, that gets you into trouble, especially around the anxiety, the need to be right,
mhm,
which is sort of silly.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
So when they can balance each other out, when the Gemini and the Sag can balance each other out, you can have ideas, but you don't take them like rock, established as serious. You don't take them like, oh, this is doctrine or this canon because I thought of it. And you can try different things on, knowing you don't have to be right.
Mhm.
It's like
Yeah,
it's
and like really the truth is that like there is not necessarily one truth, and
there's no
that needs some like Gemini to inform that for sure.
yes. The irony of Sagittarius is there's no there over there. There is no there over there. You made this up. Remember back in Gemini when we made this up?
Yeah.
So but that is why it gets interested in like natural law and what's really
Mhm.
happening and what really is a tree. I think inwardly it knows this, but it's still subject to a lot of the design flaws
Mhm.
around that kind of like, it just manifests as a zealous or just kind of
Mhm.
self-righteous, very self-convinced.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
I like the axis as a way of looking at what a sign really needs, the process within a sign, that it's really seeking the other axis,
Hmm.
seeking the other, player in that axis. It's
Hmm.
that
Yeah,
if we have a Sag process, what it really would benefit from is actually Gemini balance.
yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, and so if Sag definitely needs that Gemini balance, I feel like Gemini, at the end of the day, it's looking for that big picture. It's looking to like understand, but it's just got such a sort of view of things that that's how
Ground level view.
it anchors on the other side.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great way of looking at it. I think of Gemini without Sag as Gemini without Sag will just dig 50 holes all over the place, and they'll only go a little bit down. And the Gemini without Sag will never hit water. It'll
Yeah,
never hit water. You can't dig a well with just Gemini.
yeah,
Um, Sag, when you bring Sag's commitment and Sag's like that sort of that sense of being right, that sense of rightness that comes with truth and natural law, you just keep digging one hole in the same place.
mhm.
Eventually you get to water.
Yeah. There is like a certain level of vision there.
Yes, that's a big Sag word, right?
Yeah, and I think that that's like something that's alive in the in the fire signs in general. That was a bit of a like mind shift that was really interesting for me looking at fire signs. There is that kind of like vision that they follow.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not it's it's just its own thing. It's not really intuition. It's almost like instinct,
Yeah,
right?
it's
It's
more
a
instinctual. Yeah.
yeah, it's neat.
Hmm.
Yeah, so where Gemini is mental, Sag is relating to these qualities of like silent knowing and just quiet
Hmm.
in instinctive or intuitive kind of impulse towards.
Hmm.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything about, 'cause we've talked for almost an hour about Sag and Gemini, but right before, well, first of all, before we get into Sag Taurus and
Hmm.
Sag Cancer, these other natural oppositions that do
Okay.
occur in the sky, do you have anything that you want to say about Sag and Gemini before?
I don't think so. I think we covered things pretty well.
Cool. I was just
Right?
thinking like that's about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's the basic idea. So which is
Yeah.
cool. Cool. Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
But if we look at the early degree, and it's really just like 1 degree
Hmm.
of Sag, maybe 1.5, it actually does oppose Taurus. So we
Hmm.
have a Sag Taurus. It's pretty nominal.
Hmm.
Um, I was noticing when I looked, it's in an area of the sky that's around a fucus, which we talked about the last episode of this
Hmm.
podcast in this Axis series. But I didn't really have a lot of thoughts on that. Like I didn't develop a lot of insight thinking to myself, oh, that has anything to do with the transition into like Sag Gemini, or just nothing really struck me. So I
The one thing that strikes me is that like Taurus is very much values, and one buzzword for Sagittarius that we haven't really touched on too much actually is belief, right? And I feel like the
yeah.
two inform each other really well.
Yeah. That's a great observation, especially Taurus being so sort of inner and formulative in the same way that Gemini is a little bit like a kind of immature in
Mhm.
within this model that we're
Yeah,
using, psychological sort of individuation model. Then
yeah.
Sag is more mature. But yeah, Taurus and the values and the organization of principles is that is definitely like inextricably connected to beliefs
Mhm.
and just philosophy and a
Yeah.
whole bunch of other big sad stuff.
So that's sort of what
Well,
came to my
that's
mind.
cool.
Hmm.
Yeah. It's really it's such a sliver. It's such a sliver. It's like
Yeah.
I've never seen anyone with like an opposition in that axis.
Don't know that I have either.
Yeah, Sag Taurus.
Not one that
Sag
really came up
Taurus.
too much, anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's definitely sort of the correlate that came to my mind.
I
Um,
love that. That's a great one.
from each other back and forth, right?
Yeah. I think if you were just playing around with the synergy of Taurus and Sag, and you weren't looking at it as like, oh, well, there's a natural in conjunction there, but you were just open to how those energies might work together. Um, you have the increase of security, the increase of stability, the increase Sagittarian increase of Taurian and late Taurus at that. So it's going to be like very firmly established wealth. Perhaps that weird little slice of the sky could be associated with that in the right instance, and with the right alignments there.
Um, in one sort of correlate that I have to Taurus that's a very like specific sort of slice rather than like a whole generalization, but I do always sort of think of like the Garden of Eden when thinking of Taurus a little bit.
Yeah. Why is that?
And I don't know, just like it feels like the full potential expression of that like earthiness, right? And if we were to
Yeah.
like, care for the earth and be able to like be in symbiotic relationship, it can provide for us everything that we need,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know? And at the
I
end of
love
the
that.
day, like what's all of Sag's philosophizing for? What are we looking for? What is that truth that we're looking for? What's that thing we're trying to get to, you know?
Right, right, right. Is it a philosophical abstraction? Is it the pinnacle of idealization in our minds, or is it actually just, and I think this is the question I hear you asking. So I think I hear you saying, is it actually just simple ground level things like a
Mm,
better life and more ease and less suffering and
yeah,
having enough? Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. It doesn't have truth, doesn't have to be like some kind of be all end all that everybody goes, whoa,
Yeah, it
in
can be the
front of.
simple
It's just,
things, the little stuff.
it's water, man. It's water. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, that's great, Rio. I love that. That's delightful. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, so
Cool.
thanks.
Well, do you have thoughts on this
Mm,
Sag Cancer axis? Because at the end of Gemini, Sag
mm,
in about 6 degrees of Sag and 6 degrees of Cancer opposed. And that's actually a little more significant than I ever realized. I have to admit,
mm.
my,
Yeah, both of us were kind of surprised as we were prepping for
yeah,
this.
it's true. We were like, wow, Sag opposes Cancer. Does that
Yeah.
actually happen? And then we were like, have we ever seen that? And it turns out I don't think I've ever seen it in opposition or Sag and Cancer. So yeah, what are
I've
your
never
thoughts on that
considered it, even though I have it in my own chart, but I've just like never thought about it.
as an
Um,
opposition, right?
and as we
Well,
were
what do you have in your own chart? Can I ask you? Can I sort of flip the interview and put you on the,
sure,
can you
yeah.
talk a little bit about,
Here, I'm just gonna pull it up really quick to take a look. But the main one is I've got Jupiter just at like really like like 0 first degree Gemini opposite Saturn in Sag.
okay,
And here, let me see. I think that that's the main one, actually. Oh, and then no, because that's in Gemini. Yeah, so that's my main one.
yeah. So you have a Jupiter Saturn opposition in the Sag Gemini axis. Yeah. So
Or in
that's,
the Cancer Gemini, yeah, or Cancer Sag.
oh,
Yeah.
oh, okay. I think you said first degree Gemini. You meant first degree Cancer.
Yes, 1st degree Cancer. I've
Okay,
got
cool.
I've
And
got
that's
lots of
what we were talking about. So that all
Gemini
makes sense.
Sag oppositions, but the Jupiter Saturn is the Cancer Sag.
Wow, wow. So okay, so let me sort of like bounce off that, because
Okay.
when I was synthesizing, sort of just doing these things, putting these archetypical energies together and just playing
Hmm.
really. And with Sagittarius and Cancer, I thought, well, the combination, the sort of the blend of those energies together in an axis might be like a truth of self and origins, like truth Sag and self and origins being Cancer,
Yeah.
or it could be emotional integrity, Cancer having so much to do with our emotional expression. There could
Mhm.
be a need for Sag to align
Yeah.
that
That's certainly
emotional.
been a bit of a journey through this life, I could say.
Okay, okay,
Yeah.
cool. And then the last thing I came up with where was a sense of humor around oneself, being able to laugh, the need to develop the ability to laugh at oneself. So
Yeah. That one I had
that's
really good when I was younger,
uh
for sure. But I could like laugh
yeah.
my way through crisis really well.
Well, that's funny because when we're younger, we're much more connected to the Cancer,
Mm,
side of that axis, Cancer Capricorn. Then work takes over and we grow up, right?
mhm,
Then we do that thing, and then we don't have that childish, and that's where your Jupiter
mhm,
would have been. Then like emphasis would have shifted to your Saturn, and it would have
mhm,
been harder, even though it's a Sagittarian Saturn. It might have been harder to access that
mhm.
joviality and joie de vivre.
Yeah.
Um,
One thing that came up as we were just like chatting through things is just sort of like the process through them. Like with Gemini, I feel like we're trying to like figure out more of the world. We're sort of trying to figure out more about ourselves by learning about the outside world. And um, one thing that I tend to always say about Gemini and Cancer is that It's like in Gemini, we want to go out and have all of these different experiences. And then we hit Cancer and we have to like chill the fuck out a bit, go home and actually like process
Process, integrate,
everything that's
integrate. Right,
happened,
right.
like, okay,
Yeah,
so I've experienced all these truths. What does this
right,
mean? What is true for me? What is this
right,
like?
right, right.
There's a
Right.
huge integration process. And so maybe that has like something to do with kind of like the anchoring to like mature a little in Sagittarius, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
No, I think Sagittarius is always going to be maturing. I think Sagittarius is 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 going to be it's the resonance with truth and the way things really are, because when we're young, and it's not just correlate with Gemini, but it sort of is. When we're young, we tend to just live in a little bit more of a fantastic world, a dream world, and in a world that's a little less connected to the harsh real world. And air quotes aside, there is a real world, there is a reality, and it's harsh. And I put the air quotes up because what we get told the real world is, and this is a side layer of distortion, layers of distortion, and sort of discombobulation. What we get told is real is that's a whole other conversation. But then as we grow and mature, we sort of get where our ideas don't line up with how things really are. We get
Mhm.
disabused of those notions. And that's just like a life process. I almost feel like that's a Saturn thing, but it happens
I feel like
in
it's
a
a
Sag.
Pisces process for sure too.
Yeah, totally. Now, once you start looking at it archetypically, you can start to
Hmm.
pull other different energies in. Just to leave it with the Sag Gemini axis, I think that you have both of those relating to that Cancer Capricorn, and it's feeding into.
Hmm.
You have Gemini feeding into Cancer as these processes go, and in a way, you have the the idea of feeling established and familiar and at home. You have that predicated on who are your people, who do you understand, who can you communicate with, who can share your inner world.
Hmm.
Third house, we have siblings, we have friends, we have all that, but the fourth house is really where we're comfortable.
Hmm.
And the 10th house likewise is all of this searching and philosophical whatever in Sagittarius. And I respect all of it. I don't mean whatever, philosophical whatever. No, I love all that stuff. But
Yeah.
but if you can't make it practical, because that's where it goes to
Yeah.
Capricorn. If you can't make it practical, bring it down. If you can't come down off the mountain with something valuable for the society that you live in, see, what are you doing up there?
Hmm.
Just gazing at your navel, chanting homina homina. There's no one home. Like there's nothing there. And if it's no good, if it does, you know what I mean. If it's
Hmm. And this like and I feel like there is definitely like a sooth or a truth seeking in both between like Sag and Cancer, but one is much more like an internal process, whereas with Sag
mm,
it's more of an external
mm.
process.
I love that. Cancer is so much about the real truth of who we
Hmm.
are and where we're from.
Hmm.
And Sag is so not. Sag is so about seeing the world.
Hmm.
And but when you bring them together, yeah,
Hmm.
that's so interesting, because it's just, wow, this is how it really is. It's who I really am.
Hmm.
I love that. I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like spirituality in general, which often like when we're looking for this truth, we're looking for the answers to big questions that we don't have. So it sort of falls in the
Hmm.
category, I think.
Yeah.
There is
Yeah. Yeah.
very much a like up and out way of doing it. Like I'll just like go all the way out there. We'll just like untether the mind from the body, which
Right. Right.
I feel
Right.
like is very much more the Gemini Sag axis.
It is. It is. And then it always leads to what is that? The
Right?
road of excess leading to the palace of wisdom.
Yeah.
Is that when all these kids go off and eat ayahuasca and
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
looking for spiritual experiences, and
Everything
then they
outside of
come
the
back and they have to
show.
integrate it, and they're like, oh my God.
Right? And like
Is that
there's
yeah.
actually a lot going on in the Cancer Capricorn axis, but it's like it's much less like fluffy and exciting. It's like down and
Good.
in
Down and
Cancer.
in.
And then
That's it.
in Capricorn, it's like chop the wood,
Carry water.
hold the
Yeah.
water.
That's it. That's brilliant. Yeah, I love how you laid that out. That's very much how it is. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Should feel like, well, I don't want to go down that road. It is definitely like an external versus internal sort of ebb and flow of things.
There always is. And there's always more. You at some point you have to know what rabbit holes are extraneous and not helpful to go down,
Yeah.
Um
There's
there's
like
always
side
more. I
ones,
found that with
like go out
astrology.
and then we go in, and then we go out.
Yeah,
We go
yeah, yeah.
in.
Just for next time, there'll always be room for more podcasts, more astrology talk. Yeah, Rio.
Yeah.
That's I've had to limit myself and the rabbit holes I've gone down. I have Jupiter in Gemini, and
Mm,
I have Mars in Cancer, but neither of them are making oppositions to anything in Sagittarius.
mm,
Um, but I've found that being on the Capricorn Sagittarius cusp, my moon, I feel connected to a lot of Sagittarian processes without actually, if it makes any sense, without actually like taking full part in them.
mm.
Like optimism. Like I'm not an optimist, but I can be optimistic. I can turn it on. I can like lean into that. Like, oh, I forgot to be optimistic. Like, but yeah, it's weird. And I think honestly, I think I just opened a door that actually is in and of itself another rabbit hole. So
Mm.
I think I'm gonna, much as
Yeah.
discussed, like elect not to go down that one.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm gonna turn it over to you, Rio. You
All right.
drive. It's your podcast.
Well, let's see. I think that we've touched on all of them now. Is there any other final thoughts you had on any of them?
Hmm. I think this is so much just in this axis that tells us about our responsibility when we're developing or using or sharing or receiving information.
Hmm.
Um, but no, I don't want to repeat anything because I think we've really done the subject a thorough service. I think
Yeah.
that's all. I think I just it's interesting because you can isolate this axis and just learn so much about like correct thinking,
Mhm.
right?
Correct.
Well, correct in that it's accurate. It's accurate to reality. Correct in that if I think like, oh, if I drop this cup, gravity will send it downward. That's correct cognition. We're not going to debate gravity here and talk about am I thinking correctly.
Yeah, yeah.
You, you debate me until you're blue in the face. I drop the cup, it's going to break. It's like there is a reality. That's the thing. There is through all this abstraction and philosophical and all the rabbit holes and all the ways of looking at things.
Mhm.
There's just one thing. That's the weird thing. There's just one thing happening. It's just infinitely diverse. But yeah, so within that, I think that is an example of correct cognition. But I think within that, we can see examples of incorrect cognition.
Hmm.
That cup will never stay there in midair and float.
No.
That cup will, so
No, but if we have 10 people in the room and we ask them all to tell the story, we
that's
might
it.
get
That's it.
10 different stories.
So that's a Sag Gemini thing, right? The truth of what happens and actually is real, that's Sag. And then how people experience it and communicate about it and come together and say, oh, it's like
It feels like
it's
it's
like,
like bordering into the Cancer even too, maybe.
yeah. The Gemini Cancer thing. But I think it's like the story of the blind guys and the elephant. And one guy had the tail, and he was like, "Oh, it's like a snake." And the other guy had the ear, and he was like, "Oh, it's like a big palm leaf." And they all, and it's like Gemini is that perspectived take on the one thing, and then
Yeah,
Sag is like the one thing.
yeah.
But no, I think, you can always go on forever. There's always more rabbit holes. I think I'll just like
All right,
stop
cool.
there.
I think that I've covered everything that I wanted to say.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. Do you have anything going on you'd like to tell the people about?
Um, Strangely, no. No, I've just been settling in. I moved house. I'm back to making monthly lunar cycle videos. So if you're just watching this, let's see, we're recording this on January 16th. There's a new moon on January what is it, 23rd? Do I have that date right? I have to.
Probably. I don't know. I
Could
haven't.
be, it could even be the 21st. I actually think I have the date wrong. Just
Okay.
winging it. I think I made a mistake there. But at any rate, yeah, so I'm back to making lunar cycle
Hmm.
videos. I'm seeing clients again. So I'm doing work around natal charts, transits, people uh come to see me especially around the evolutionary astrology thing. And that's been uh an amazing journey.
Nice.
But no, nothing, you know, uh, it's winter. I'm just, keeping it really low key. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I'll put your links down below. And, I don't know
thank
the
you.
dates off the top of my head, but if you'd like to know the dates for everything for the rest of the year, I've got a calendar. Um,
Nice. Yeah.
I got a calendar that I made that's like full of artwork that I did. It's super cool. I'll put links for that below too.
True
And
story.
I think that that's that for today. But thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me. As always, it was a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Rita. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And all you folk out there, stay starry.
Stay starry.